I'm giving it all out today. I'm going to talk everything, my ideologies in terms of programming, periodization, session structure, everything like that. This is how I holistically view everything and how I've set myself up to have guiding principles on how I approach programming. Simple as that. So first, the preface, I should say, is that this should all be taken with the consideration that you understand who you're working with. That's going to be the greatest guiding principle, is who you're working with, what you have to work with, when you're able to do it, time frame, resources, training tenure, demographic, inputs, outputs, everything like that. You have to understand, or at least attempt to understand, encapsulate the holistic influences before we look at the nitty-gritty stuff of programming. But basically, I'm going to go over session dynamics, associating nomenclature to session outcomes and intentions so that you can create a common language amongst those that you work with, and also what those sessions look like. Session structure, I'm literally going to break down lifts. Generally, the two types of lifts I have, conditioning, and then speed, agility, quickness, and then periodization. This is a pretty loose term now because we're realizing that everything that we do is going to be directly correlated with how we react to something, our input, athletes, injuries, travel, games, practices, all these sort of things. But still, it's good to have a plan. So I'll show you how I go about that. So number one, session dynamics. There's 4 types of sessions that we're going to see, and these are directly related in response to travel, to practice, to games. All right. We have a brick day. It sounds like it sounds. We're laying bricks. It's the foundations that we're building for long-term development. These are our heaviest and high CNS, high tissue days, right? So we're putting the most amount of volume and intensity on these days. It's furthest from game day. So there's the least amount of interference. These are the days where we're laying those bricks to the long-term foundation, right? Luckily, in that off-season period or early preseason with less game density and practice density, we're able to have a few more bricklaying days versus competitive phases where we'll only have maybe one, sometimes none. Supercharged days, those are going to be your strength, speed, power development, force expression days, those high muscle fiber recruitment rate coding style training, right? Usually coming pre-game or depending on season phase, late off season when we're in that more transitionary period towards a strength, speed, power development phase, we'll see a bit more of that. It also encompasses speed sessions. Engine day or conditioning day is where we're going to get predominantly our aerobic power and capacity work in. Obviously, dependent on sport, if you're more of an aerobic driven sport, we're going to probably utilize a bit more of that anaerobic pathway development. But myself working with predominant intermittent anaerobic based sports, we're going to target predominantly aerobic development. So this takes the form of conventional means and methods of intervals, Norwegian method, mass, or it might also take the shape of metabolic conditioning, Metcons, CrossFit, High Rocks, or boot camp style trainings. These are occurring probably 2-3 days out from our games. And it takes the form of more of a supplementary and complementary as well as a collaborative role when we get into season, right? So these are the types of sessions that maybe aren't even directly run by us, but it's influenced by us to allow the sport coaches to run efficient conditioning within their practices. It's directly reactive in conjunction to what is being done in practice. If we're lucky enough to know when their high and low days are, we can associate additional work. Top-up days for specific athletes also would fall under this category. Recharge day, your regeneration day, your recovery day. The idea is get in blood flow. If we're on the road and we have days between games, we're getting in, we're moving, we're mobilizing, we're just generally getting blood flow going. The idea is just to keep the engine in good condition, right? Following the engine in recharge days, this is when we would place the top-up sessions for athletes who didn't travel, additional RTP work, or people just not getting lots of game time. In a game like hockey, goalies only playing 1 of every 2, 1 of every 3. That's a good time to get them additional work. So in general, we have those 4 sessions within a week. How we allocate them, as mentioned, is going to be dictated by game schedule, practice, intensity, and schedule, and then anything else that's thrown our way. Now, when we go into session structure, this is the nitty-gritty stuff that people like to talk about. What are you doing, when and where? How are you setting it up? I have a loose structure that I like to follow predominantly for the reason that it creates consistency for myself. It creates consistency for coaches or anyone that might have to step in and lead a session. And it also creates consistency for the athletes. They know what the sequence is, right? So they know that after a couple of months they're coming in and they're going to go boom, boom. So with response to sequence, it's particularly important that we're sequencing our movements in relation to their tolerance to fatigue, right? I think this is pretty common ground, but we are going to sequence movements that require more like PCR, anaerobic glycolytic type pathways early on. If we're looking for fast twitch muscle fiber development, anything that's explosive and requires quick recovery and quick energy usage, plyometric, ballistics, Olympic lifts, throws, stuff like that. Those are going early. They are sensitive to fatigue, meaning if we did place them later on, the adaptive response would be a lot lower. We simply wouldn't get as much out of it. Are you going to be able to throw a med ball faster at the end of your workout or at the beginning? Freshness matters. So what requires most amount of freshness goes first. Simple stuff. Secondary is going to be the highest fatigue accruing movements. So things that fatigue predominantly the central nervous system the most. Your heavy lifts, right? And then tertiary is going to be more of those peripheral fatiguing movements, things that still see good adaptation under fatigue and sometimes that are better performed under fatigue. They are far more fatigue tolerant. So fatigue sensitive to fatigue tolerant. So the way I structure things, first of all, I'm not going to go over specific conventional warm-up and cool-down. I use warm-up and cool-down or that block of time as an opportunity to allocate extras or specific needs of the athlete, position, and or holistic sport demands. So, for example, in a sport like hockey, you have a goalie. Their specific positional demands are going to be different from that of a forward and a defenseman. But there are holistic sport demand needs that filter down across all positions that they'll also get exposed to, and at the same time giving something that the athlete particularly needs. Now obviously we don't have a lot of time to be able to do this for 60 athletes, but in general, if you're noticing that the team needs greater ankle mobilization, you can put something in there for that. The goalies need hip mobility, we can put some of that in there. And then we see a general struggle within hockey players of hip flexor strength, so we could put something in like that. So it's a couple exercises that they can do in transition between sport practice and training, or that they can do in extras. And the same thing follows for cool down. We'll provide additional stuff, but in general, we also set up a consistent cool down. Us is the legs up on the wall, toes up, toes down, left over, right, bent, half bent butterfly, pull the ankle, push the knee, then pull the knee, 30 to 45 seconds each, butterfly, off the wall, cobra, tabletop rotations, pigeon, hip 90-90s. You're all done in 5 minutes. The athletes know it after a couple weeks. They can do it on their own time when they're on the road without help. So when we look at session structure, we've gone over sequence, warm-up, cool-down, we're all good. Now we hop into prep. This is where I'm front-loading or utilizing the most exposure to human force. So a term coined by Hunter Eisenhower that relates to the innate human movements. So crawling, hanging, tumbling, grappling. It could even be throwing, picking, putting down. These sort of things that you do on a playground and you just do innately as a human being. But with the predominant form of loading is through our human body movement. So one important thing here when it comes to human force, I'm not super specific with it. I do, however, have to say that it is particularly more beneficial when you allocate a human force movement that directly correlates with the predominant intentions of this session. And for the most part, athletes are getting off the ice or they're coming in and they're either just milling through the warm-up. So the human force is a great opportunity to get an additional global warm-up. But in general, it's going to encompass, like I said, innate human movements, but also close and open agility style drilling games, ball games, partner combatives, and then just general self-organization through hanging or crawling and stuff like that. So then we go on to force expression. I generally allocate 3 force expression movements per lift session. So the only time this will change is when we go to a supercharge session where we're going to actually have 4 or 5. We'll extend it a little bit further because we're trying to chase those particular adaptations. So just generally more exposure, but we'll talk about that in a second. So force expression, this is where the archetyping starts to come in. So in general, we know that there's 3 general types of athletes. There's the 2 distinct muscular and elastic, and then there's the hybrid in the middle, whereby we're talking about force dominant, we're talking about force expression dominant, and then force expression deficient. It's a continuum, there's a lot of variables there, but in general we have our strong that needs to get fast, and explosive. We have our explosive needs to get strong, and then we have our generally strong or in the middle that needs to be able to express faster. So anyways, what archetype they are is going to generally dictate what kind of forced expression we're going to get. We have 3. I predominantly put 2 weaknesses in, followed by a strength. So for example, we have an elastic athlete. They're indicative of lack of ankle, hip mobility in general. They're stiff, they're springy, they have minimal knee and hip flexion when they're jumping. They're expressive dominant, so they can quickly express force, but they don't have a huge capacity for it, for example. So what does that relate to? Quick ground contacts, stiffness, and really good efficiency of this stretch shortening cycle. So now we want to use something that's a longer ground contact, maybe more compliant, depth landing with the compliancy, maybe some loaded jumps to really force them to spend more time on the ground, horizontal projection. Another note to add is there's often a correlation between what I'm putting in terms of force expression weaknesses and the phase of sprinting that we're in. If we're in a short or long phase where horizontal versus vertical projection matters. But in general, it's going to be correlated to our general session intended outcome, and it's going to be a weakness. Number 3 is going to be a ballistic or a tertiary work on, but it's usually going to be a strength. So you have that elastic athlete who's really springy. We'll get them doing pogos, some sort of multi-directional rapid ground contact movement. All right. As we move on, reminding ourselves about the sequencing of fatigue tolerance, we then go to our most global and taxing movement of strength. If it's a brick day and our main session intention is lower body strength, it's GPP, we go with a heavy knee hip dominant movement, trap bar deadlift or a back squat per se. That'll come up first. And I'll usually pair that with one of 3 things. For the most part, it's going to be a contrasted movement so that we're getting exposure to a bit more rapid muscle fiber recruitment. So for example, if we go of a same movement style, so we go back squat in a band assisted reflexive jump or a box jump or something like that. Depending again what's on archetype, usually what I'm doing is taking the strength movement and that's a weakness. So if you have an elastic athlete, we're going to take something that they're going to be able to load up the most. Obviously they tend to lack mobility, so we go with something that, like a trap bar deadlift, that's going to allow us to maximize the amount of load that we can get them to lift. Weakness, and then it's going to follow it with a contrasted movement that they like to do or they're predisposed to being good at. So a fast jump, something like that for an elastic athlete, maybe a box jump or a loaded jump for a muscular athlete. So that's one. Option number 2 is adding mobility. That's either complementary or antagonistic to the movement, squat with some sort of hip mobility. Or the third option is a completely opposite stimulus. So we have a lower body and then we do an upper body supplementary. So we do a single arm landmine press after the squat. Same sort of thing is going to happen in strength too. So we'll go lower body strength if that's the primary focus, then we'll go upper body strength, press or pull with a supplemental movement of upper mobility or lower. Then we'll hit an accessory. The accessory 1 and 2 is going to be a global need from the team perspective. So if we've assessed that shoulder stability is a need, hip mobility and or strength is an issue, so we can hammer the glutes, we can get the erectors, we can work on the hip flexors, adductors. It's a global need, and it's generally related to a global sport demand need. Final accessory is going to usually find itself in the category of core, not because its importance is lesser. We'll also sometimes pair it up top, but this is something we can do together. But we're targeting flexion extension, anti-rotation, rotation. This is a component that's going to change based on what day we're doing and the amount of fatigue it'll accrue, but in general we're getting some form of core in. The session structure for conditioning, it's going to remain the structure in general the same for all types of sessions. The only thing that's going to change obviously is the amount of time allocated to certain components. So for conditioning, we're not going to be doing a lot of accessories in this, that, or the other. We're just sticking to our intervals or whatever we're going to do. But we are going to warm up with a human force that's going to take a bit more of the form of crawling, change of direction, combative, stuff like that. And then it'll lead into our conditioning. SAQ, once again, a human force, combatives approach where we're getting the most amount of our change of direction exposures from a true agility standpoint in there. then followed by skill development, so working on crossovers, shuffles, drop steps, stuff like that, closed skill development through drill, and then it'll go into either of the main session focuses, so agility through change of direction, or quickness, or with our sprint, so acceleration or max velocity, depending on season phase. So that's in general the session structure. All right, human force prep, force expression, strength, pipe bone, more or less, with some core. The only time that's going to change is when we go to a supercharged day, as I mentioned. The structure of that is essentially human force warm-up and then prep. And then when we go into the force expression, we're just going to extend those sets to 4 or 5. So we can just get a little more exposure to those fast muscle fiber recruitment style movements. And then we would have 2 trisets. First one is going to be lower body, crew a little bit more stress, but we're going to go to some form of partial squat cluster for velocity, a loaded jump, and then a multi-directional unloaded jump. And then same sort of thing for upper body. We go heavy bilateral push, and a loaded push throw, and then a reflexive pull or push. And then core dependent on time and necessity. Then when we go to periodization, all right, so this is going to be pretty loose. We have to associate particular blocks because that's going to be the northern star that's guiding us in terms of what we're trying to do. So when we look at a GPP block, we have to understand that that involves some form of tempo, unilateral loading. We're trying to build structural and tissue tolerance for subsequent phases. So those are guiding principles. And then what allows us to definitively put pen to paper is who we're working with, how much time we have, what we have to work with, the usual, right? So for me, the athletes come in early September. It's a hit or miss as to what and how they've been training. Some of them train full-time on what we provide them, while others, they go to the other coaches, etc. So you never really know exactly what you're getting. So GPP block, 2-3 weeks. It's also a hectic start, the type of school I'm working at. And junior teams where they're coming in, new team, been traveling around, it's quite different, right? So we use 2 to 3 weeks as coaches to analyze our athletes and identify their archetypes, any changes in movement literacy, in capacities. We're doing baseline testing, and this is just an ability for us to get everyone up to speed. Simple as that. Then we go into accumulation block. We do start playing games pretty early, but it's pretty light density of practice in games. So I'm going to front load that intensity so we can allow that to super compensate over a while into the later parts of the season. So we use a 4 to 6 week accumulation block. We're just amplifying that frequency and particularly volume, changing up some movements to just avoid boredom, and then move into an intensification block where we're actually chasing a little bit more on the velocity side of things, not necessarily volume, but overall intensity of sets as we approach November. And then we're going to get into the competition phase. This is the longest part of our season, about 3-4 months. And this is really a reactive time of year. So we're reacting to what's in front of us. I'm going to set up what I call a double undulating concurrent periodization model throughout this time. That's about 8 to 12 weeks. Basically, that's a week A and a week B, where we're targeting the same physical qualities, but from a different angle, if you will. So for an example, if we're doing a brick day, and we're trying to improve lower body strength, we can do that multiple different ways. One way being back squats, conventional 3x6, let's say at a 75 to 80%. Let's just say that. And then week 2, we would take still a knee hip dominant movement, but load it differently and then approach it from a different standpoint in terms of reps. So trap bar deadlift, cluster 3-3-3. So they understand the structure of the workout. They're just targeting it from a slightly different stimulus. What this is going to do is prolong our ability to expose them to adequate stimulus. It's a more of a slow burn effect so that when we get into the latter part of the competition, they're still making progress, but we're not overloading them. So some questions there might be, well, that's quite a bit of novelty, but I've come to find that, well, especially with the plasticity of younger athletes, when you after the first 2 weeks, especially when you introduce it ahead of a long break, you can maximize the output of that. And then when they return, they're fully adapted and ready and super compensated to go. And then we see consistent progress over time like that. Same thing goes for supercharged days. Same thing goes for your secondary brick or engine days. It's just adding variety. From there, once it gets to playoffs, it's reaction, right? So Sometimes you plan on having them 2-3 times a week, and turns out they're actually traveling on a Wednesday instead of a Thursday, so you only get 2, and they just came off a long weekend. Maybe we're going to scratch a session, or we're going to throw an extra recharge and do a double recharge. Maybe we just scratch a session and just do one hard engine. So you have to be reactive to what's going on. There's also injuries, there's RTP, and we're also at the mercy of the school, what that schedule is, exams, and all these other crazy stressors like winter colds and relationships and yada. It all comes into factor. So we have to be able to pivot. However, at the end of the season, once all is said and done, hopefully we've lifted the cup, but we go into a transition period. That's going to be 2 weeks of nothing. Forget about the sport, forget about everything. Obviously, there's a lot of athletes that demand and require routine. So I'm going to provide a minimum effective dose, something that just try and make sure they keep moving, but not at the detriment of long-term performance. Obviously, to mention, there's formal education that's provided all throughout. So we're able to get them to understand the importance and necessity of sport, its role in sport development, and the importance of rest and recovery. So transition, we got 2 weeks of rest, and then 2-3 weeks of anatomical adaptation, GPP style programming 3 times a week, just to get the body back and let it come out of dormancy, if you will. Then we do follow a structured anatomical adaptation / GPP phase. Basically same thing, where we're just structurally preparing the body for subsequent phases. And then we hop right into strength hypo 1 and 2. And then whether we transition to a speed strength or a power development block is going to be more dependent on the cohort and then just general training tenure and athlete needs. Some athletes are playing in a lot of camps, are going to play summer sport. So how we're going to approach that is going to be a bit different from those that are just strictly going home to eat, train. So those are different variables, but in general, strength hypo, kind of low, slow burn, be able to get as much crude stimulus in terms of hypertrophic gains and strength gains as we can. Regardless, they're getting a lot of exposure to speed strength throughout the year, so it's not going to go without progress there. Then we get back into the next season, and it's rinse and repeat. So a few things to understand and remind ourselves here. I've found to be a rather great way of approaching programming. It gives us session dynamics. It allows us to create the nomenclature that's consistent across our whole program, that people know today's brick day, we're going hard. All right, we know what's ahead of us and what the intent needs to be. Oh, great, today's a recharge day. I get to take it a little bit easier. And that's as us as coaches too, that we know that we can bring it on this day and really ask the most of them, versus this one, it's okay if they slack, right? So that's been good in terms of a psychological component of being able to associate days with the level of intent. Session structure, it's going to vary, like I said. You have to be able to have tools to put it in here. I don't expect anyone to ever come on here and make a video and tell you exactly what to do and for it to work for your cohort. You have to be able to identify a sequence that makes sense, that is related to the demands of the sport, but also the body's ability to adapt. And that's going to work within the confines that you're working in. And then from a periodization standpoint, look, this is pretty conventional, comes out of a textbook. How you fit this into this, related to that, related to everything else, is what's going to allow you to have a good program. A few tips, things I have all interns do, and I think is an extremely important exercise, is do a self-audit. Be able to do this, be able to break down your program. Take the last program you did, even if you're looking at this and you're like, oh, I didn't do any of that, doesn't matter. Take your last program, break it down to every detail you possibly can. You start with the program, what kind of day is it? What was the intention? Look at your sequence, where it goes. And don't even start thinking about it if you should move things. Just look at each exercise. First thing you have on your sheet, I have a box squat. What does that involve? What muscles, what tendons, what ligaments, what energy system, right? What type of movement pattern is it? Break it all the way down. All right, do that for everything. Then start asking your questions if things would move and fit in different places. And some people won't like this, but this is probably the most efficient way to get better at programming, is buy other people's programs and do that same audit. Ask yourself why they put it there, how that relates to other things. And then look at it from a microcycle standpoint. Why are they programming speed on this day, strength on this day, engine on this day, and then taking a break? Why did they do that? Why do some people start on a Sunday? Why do people only work out once or twice a week? Understand that. Start looking at details, overall volume in a program of how many exposures to volume that a particular muscle is getting. How many sets and reps of chest are you doing compared to lower limb? Anyways, that's just a great way of doing things. You'll get access to a lot of good programs. You're helping someone, I guess, if you want to look at it that way, and you're predominantly helping yourself by adding more tools to your tool belt. Ultimately, none of this matters unless you're able to have enough tools to be able to assess and react to situations. There's athletes that are going to come up and say, I don't like this. And instead of taking that personally, you can then go and be like, we're going to do this instead, and problem solve for them. Same thing goes with injuries. Some things go with change in positions, change in teams. If you're working with young athletes like I'm working with, you might have different athletes from September to June dealing with that adolescence, right? So general recap, self-audit, identify commonalities, and increase your bandwidth of tools that allow you to problem solve on the fly with respect to your goal and to the needs of your athletes. That's pretty much everything. Jayberry, the coach on Instagram. Shoot me as many messages as you like. I love talking to people and answering questions. This YouTube video, comment, let me know some things on there. Reach out to me personally, whatever it may be. And hope you enjoy.